As the Crow Flies on the Vance Crow Podcast.
Jayson Lusk, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Vance. Thanks for having me on.
Excuse me, I should have said PhD, Dr. Emeritus. You are a very important, distinguished scholar in the world of agricultural economics, and I'm proud to have you on.
Yeah, Jason's just fine.
So I want to jump right into what's going on in the world, because this is a rare moment that we have in that we are in the middle of gigantic change happening. For the first time, my mother-in-law went to the store, and the first time in her lifetime, she's seeing that there are things that have not been delivered. They're going to shut down the fish and meat section in our grocery store. There were produce that just wasn't available. It's the first time in her memory that that's ever happened, certainly in mine. It's April 8th, 2020. What is going on right now with the supply chain for food in the United States?
Well, it's a little bimodal, but in some ways we're getting a little more back to normal, at least on the grocery side. So we had this really big run up in stocking behavior that led to those empty aisles and empty shelves that your mother-in-law commented on. And I think it speaks a lot to how much we take for granted in our food supply chain, that we just expect stuff to be there regardless of whether it's in season or what's happening. But, so I think we had this, really unprecedented period where consumers were buying much more than normal in grocery store settings. It led to stockouts. It led to run up in prices for a lot of food commodities. I think we're starting to kind of level off of that a little bit. I mean,
I'm saying this happened to my mother-in-law today.
Today. Okay. Yeah.
So at my local grocery store, there is a lack of produce on the shelves, and there is seafood counters being shut down. Yeah. So, I mean, I know the run up, the toilet paper and all of those things, but I haven't been in a grocery store in over a month, but this is, firsthand, I've heard it. There are supply problems.
Yeah. I don't disagree, and I won't say it's normal. I'm saying it's closer to normal than what we saw 2 weeks ago. And, I think we're certainly not in a situation where there's no food. It may be the kind of food I normally get isn't there, or even in the the height, I think, of this stocking out period, people posting these pictures on social media and everything. Normally, if you look in the background, there's like another shelf in the background that has something on it. It's just like we're so shocked it's out of bread, but there may be the gluten-free bread or the tortillas or whatever. So I think there's been this temporary disruption that happened from, restaurants not being open. There's a disruption of that supply chain, trying to get things back into grocery stores. And I think some of that we're better situated than we were a couple of weeks ago. Where the vulnerabilities lie, I think, we're kind of entering into a period where, it's the potential shutdown or slowdown of several of the food processing facilities. So there's several reports coming out in the last few days of meat processing facilities either shutting down or scaling back.
Which ones are you talking about specifically? There are a lot of cattle ranchers that listen to this show, and
there's a plant in beef processing plant in Pennsylvania. There's I think JBS shut down one in Iowa. There's another one they shut down. So I actually thought to myself this morning, I need to be keeping a list of this. So I haven't done that yet. There's been at least 3 or 4 closures that I've seen.
I saw in the state of Nebraska, somebody was asking the governor to shut something down in JBS. Yeah. I mean, to me, shutting down the meat system in the U.S. or any part of this processing, that's a scary thought. I don't think people realize that we have been able to fulfill the demand for beef for 40 years, 60 years with no hiccups, and then now we're going to have one. That means something real has happened.
I agree, and I think that's one in the next coming weeks is where I think some of the vulnerabilities are, because these processing plants are big. Any one of those plants might account for 5, maybe even more % of the total aggregate supply. So you shut one down, that's enough to cause disruptions and price spikes on the retail side, but also reductions in price on the cattle side, which is very concerning for the folks there. So I think that's the thing I'm kind of keeping an eye out on for the next, few days and weeks, where I think there could be, even more disruption than what we've seen at present.
Yeah, I was reading reports, Kevin Folta, who was the former head of horticulture studies at the University of Florida, posting a link about hundreds of trucks which haul hundreds of thousands of pounds of fresh produce are not leaving Florida with all that produce, and it's being left to rot in the fields. And I don't think it takes that many truckloads to start having people feel that pinch in some way.
I agree. I mean, I think it's really, for somebody like in my position right now, I'm hungry for data. What can we learn about what's happening? And one of the big challenges is a lot of what we know about production, ag production, happens on a seasonal or annual basis from the USDA, and it's often lagged by a month or weeks. So it's just not very helpful in this time. So one signal that's helpful sometimes that you can look at are prices. Prices are a signal of scarcity. And so that's why I've been paying a lot of attention to, are we seeing prices increase? And
I haven't seen that. What is going on?
Well, it varies a lot. And I think that's why I kind of mentioned a little bit of a return to normal. If you look at meat prices, wholesale meat prices, which get reported on a much more frequent basis than retail, there was a big run up. We saw, maybe it depends on the commodity, but big increases in wholesale meat prices, but then they started to fall about a week ago, and so it started coming back down. One that was really crazy was eggs. So like wholesale prices of eggs, tripled basically, and really just today, and I looked, and they've started to come down some. So the fact that these are coming down, that suggests to me that there's a lot in inventory. There's stuff in cold storage, and doesn't mean it can't go back up again, but that's at least signaling to me that just in terms of aggregate quantity supplied, we're okay. But it's much harder. I haven't seen good data on, say, the fruits and vegetables, and that's one I think that are maybe a little more vulnerable for a variety of reasons.
Well, I am gladdened, I guess, to hear you say what you're saying. I was just talking with a woman on Sunday night whose family owns an egg facility outside of Syracuse, New York. And she said, we have pallets and pallets and pallets of eggs. We were prepared for Easter, and this whole thing that was going to happen. And now we can't get them out because of biohazard laws, and we can't sell them into the community. And so we had a hyper efficient system with really good biosecurity and a lot of regulations that would normally allow the farmers sitting just outside in the countryside to get in and feed consumers. They're blocking people in some ways.
Yeah, I think, if prices continue to increase, egg prices tripling, you may see some civil disobedience out there. Some of these laws that make sense when times are normal and you have supply chains that are optimized for just-in-time delivery, they don't make as much sense. Some of these times you mentioned some egg laws. I think the eggs are regulated by the FDA. FDA, was reconsidering, some of its rules around reselling eggs, and eggs that were destined to, restaurants. My understanding was they had some trouble turning around and selling those back to grocery stores because of some laws.
And wouldn't that be nice if right now all those restaurants that are normally used to being a part of the supply chain, instead of putting food out the front, put it out the back and let people be cooking at home? That would be fantastic.
I totally agree. And, again, all these are kind of anecdotal, but I've, read a handful of these stories about restaurants in LA, their local governments, saying, no, you need a certificate or an approval to be able to sell, takeaway food, or you can't, sell prepackaged items directly to consumers. I mean, I think in this time that's just nuts, and I think most consumers realize it's nuts. This may be one of those things that changes how we think about government regulation. It may shift all kinds of things about what we prioritize. That, when everything's fine and dandy, we can prioritize safety and like increasing amounts of safety.
Well, I'll give you one that people are going to really be feeling right now. And I know because my wife and I had to have this discussion today when she looked at the expiration date on the food, right? We have put that in so it is hyper secure so that like 0.0001% of the problems don't happen. But now you're going to have people looking at their stores and saying, I don't have a paycheck coming in. This is a month or, over on this can. Can I eat it? And that's where you got to ask yourself, how tight are our regulations? How good are they?
I agree. And most of those, like in the, some of those sell by or use by dates are hyper conservative. For a lot of them, you can go past them. Somebody's going to sue me, as soon as they get sick from eating them. But again, when things are good, you err on the side of caution often. But when things get a little tight, other priorities take over. I'd actually agreed to write an article about food waste many months before all this stuff happened, and so I finally had a few spare minutes, given how all of our schedules have changed. And I sat down to write that article. I thought, this whole topic just feels so different now for a variety of reasons. Both because on the one hand, consumers, when they got nervous, got a little panicked. Boy, we stocked up, and you look at the data on the increase of foot traffic to grocery stores, it went through the roof. And so that told me, like, in the moment, people were like, forget food waste. I just want to make sure I have food. That's like number one priority. And then, like, carrying on to what you just mentioned, to the extent times get really lean, or there really is scarcity, we don't need somebody nannying us and telling us to stop wasting food. We'll do it, because it's a matter of eating and not eating.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. My wife and I haven't let a piece of produce walk out of here in our garbage can since this stuff happened, because if we have it and it's green, we're eating it.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And so I think it does show. I'm an economist, so I'm biased and I see economics and everything, but I've always argued to people that food waste is an economic concept. It's not an accounting of, how much did we produce versus how much did we, eat. And that difference is, food waste, but it's a concept that varies with incentives, and people respond to those incentives.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And when it's not the nanny state in there involved, people end up figuring out the thing that's right for them that maximizes what they need. So speaking of maximization, I mean, I've started to have to come to terms with, you and I have met while I was working at Monsanto. We would occasionally go to places where you'd be speaking and I'd be there to look, the World Food Prize, for example.
Yeah.
And, I fell in love with large scale and efficient when I went to Monsanto. I had started as a person that felt like Monsanto's evil, big farming is destroying everything. And then I go in there and I discover, whoa, wait a second, I was wrong. Large industrial efficient farms are amazing. But then I think I took it a step too far, because I now have the perception that I am damn glad that there are some people that are local and not selling only into the commodity system.
Yeah, all things in moderation, right? I was and probably am still very much of the perspective that you mentioned that you took on at Monsanto, and that is that I think that's an aspect of our food system that a lot of people take for granted, that how efficient that we are at producing a lot of things. And I think in some ways we are more so this really gets to the question of resiliency. This is a total hypothetical. Let's imagine we could have, some plant in the middle of the United States that was like the most efficient plant, and we could just run all of our food through it and redistribute it out to the country. And let's just say that was the cheapest thing possible. There'd be a lot of good with that in the sense of, maybe providing affordable food. But the downside is if you got this one big, center, a tornado happens, a drought happens, or a disease like we're seeing now happens. So in that sense, that kind of system where requires economies of scale to gain efficiency. And so you end up with, a handful of very large facilities that does have a kind of vulnerability that we're sort of looking at right now. And I think it is moments like this that make me appreciate that more than I probably have in the fact. Now, I will argue the other side of this. I mean, I think one of the things we may see coming out of this are people are going to be a lot more, I don't know what the right word is for it, populist, nationalist with regard to their food, more interested in local, regional. And I think will be a natural reaction. One thing I would caution, though, is there are forms of a global food system that are resilient in a different dimension. So I just mentioned drought, for example. If you rely on just produce grown in your area or region and there's a drought, you're screwed, or a flood. So there are benefits to being linked in global markets, that if things go bad where I'm at, I can go buy from the world market over here where times are good to help bail me out. So there are forms of resiliency in being interconnected in these global food markets. So I don't want to give that up either. But I think, I wouldn't say it's changed my entire worldview, but I think, on the margin, it's made me certainly more appreciative of a different form of resiliency that you get through smaller, more heterogeneous operations operating in different areas.
Yeah, I this has been one of those paradigm changing things for me, which I think is good, because it allows you to see the whole picture with a lot more fidelity.
I think backyard chicken coop sales are going to go through the roof in the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, but most of those people have never plucked a chicken before.
No, I didn't say it's a good or bad thing. It's just a prediction.
I mean, I think it'd be really, really nice to have eggs right now, right? For a few months, it'd be nice if that's all I had to do. But I've killed my own chicken when I was living in Africa and plucked the feathers. And I can tell you that most of the meal, because I was not good at it, I spent pulling feathers out of my mouth. So people have no idea, a lot of them, that they've never even seen the chicken with the feathers on it at all. So there's definitely a demand, a need for processors, and thank God they've been there.
Well, and I do think maybe, sorry to interrupt you here, but this gets back to a little bit of our discussion about regulatory barriers. And I do think in meat and animal produce, there's a lot of regulatory barriers that have prevented it create high cost for small scale processors to operate. And a lot of that's around packing plant regulations. And they're there for food safety reasons, presumably. But even before this, I would say I was very much of the mindset that we ought to find ways to allow, more vibrancy in this kind of local meat economy that is sort of trapped because of various state and federal regulatory problems that really create really high costs for small scale producers.
I just got done speaking with Matt Ridley. Are you familiar with him? He wrote The Rational Optimist. So he was on this morning, and I mean, he is the guy that opened my eyes to the way that large companies end up getting regulations put on them gladly. Go ahead, put more regulations on me and everybody else, because it creates a moat that says then these small companies can't start. And that's when you have this government business relationship that's kind of uncomfortable. And this is the kind of situation where you could tear a lot of those walls down.
I don't disagree. And I think you're right about a lot of that. I think often, even for your former employer that you just mentioned, my point of view has been not to get mad at them, but to make sure that that it's easy for other companies to compete with them. And I think a natural tendency of anybody that's gotten big enough is to increase the cost of entry. And a big way to do that is to increase regulatory cost. Because if I'm big, I can afford teams of lawyers to help me interpret all that. And it makes it really hard for the small person to enter. And so, I think that's an unfortunate reality of our existence, and this may be hopefully one of those opportunities where we can help reduce some of those entry costs.
What do you think is going on in the minds of governments all over the world regarding their food security? Because we have it good. We've got a lot of meat, we've got a lot of grains, and things could go really, really wrong here. But there are a lot of places they don't have this. Yeah.
Well, I think they're thinking about, food security. Number one, do we have enough food to feed everybody? And, here in the U.S., as you mentioned, we're fortunate to be a net exporter of agricultural commodities. We send more food abroad than we import. And so just in terms of pounds of food, we're in pretty good shape. Now, do we have all the workers to get it to us in the supply chain? That's, maybe a different question. But just in terms of total production, we look like we're in pretty good shape. But so one of the things I see governments doing in different places around the world are stopping exports. We're going to not allow food to leave our country because they're wanting to protect their own, food supply. I personally think I understand the motivation. I think in the long run, that's a mistake. First of all, it hurts your domestic producers. So it makes them less viable in the long run when they can't sell more broadly, but also it kind of gets you in a potential situation where there's a lot of tit for tat. Well, you're not going to sell me this, I'm not going to sell you that, and then we all kind of end up potentially in a worse situation. Although in the moment, I understand why people are doing it. So I think that's kind of number one priority, though, is do we have enough food? And I think, I've seen this conversation already happening in the UK, largely because of Brexit, but around this thought that, there they actually import way more than they export. And, talking about food as a national security issue. And I know that's one of the arguments producers will make, farmers will make for various forms of farm protections and subsidies is a national security argument. Without calling it good or bad, I suspect that argument will be more persuasive in the coming months.
I was watching on Facebook I barely have any time for anything, but when I do, I want to know. Twitter tells me what are the people that I follow thinking about, so that's like a much more concentrated thing. But then Facebook drops me into networks of people I'm friends with, but not necessarily people that I pay attention to what their news is or what they are thinking about. And I saw this thread on people complaining that they're running out of coffee at their houses. And they don't want to go to the store, so they're stuck at what they can get delivered. And the delivery cost for a giant bag of coffee went from $35 to $65. And
wow.
They said, this is outrageous. There's a special place in hell for price gougers during a thing like this. And that got me thinking, I think we're in a precarious position because most people don't understand economics. So if you don't think that there is something that changes price other than people are greedy, you can have real revolutions in a community.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I use my social media in a similar way that you do. Twitter is where I go to see the news and kind of analysis, and Facebook is where I go see real people, the real people I know, who are not economists or followers of ag markets, and I think, again, I don't know that populism is the right word, but, calls for price controls, calls for, among, farmers that aren't getting prices they think they deserve, for the government to step in and, take over various segments and regulate. I think there's going to be a lot of those kind of calls. I kind of bristle at a lot of that, and I understand.
Bristle. This is literally a change to our nation. This is like when you invoke the American Defense, whatever the act is, where now you start saying you guys produce this and you guys produce that. Untold of chaos is being thrown into the market. Who knows? Maybe GM is needed to have the drive terrains to make the ambulances run. Maybe they shouldn't be producing ventilators. You start getting central control, things get out of control, then they need to control more. It's not a good thing.
That's right. It feeds upon itself. And, I will say, this, I think, will maybe sound a little heartless, but I think it is true that, when we see these price increases, sometimes it's hard to know what's gouging and what's not. But at least, in a lot of cases, that price increase is actually what you want to see, because that increasing price is the signal to other sellers and producers to realize, I need to figure out I can deliver coffee for much cheaper than $60 a delivery. And if we don't have these prices signaling those things to us, we don't know that there are opportunities, and those opportunities is what brings that price back down.
That is amazing. That's exactly right. It's when you see a price that's too high, somebody is abdicating a responsibility. You could get in there and fill that in some way that's faster. You will.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And then, but if you just say, okay, we're just going to cap these prices, you can't sell eggs for more than whatever, $5 a dozen or something. What are egg producers going to do? Let's say, they're going to say, well, okay, maybe I'll idle a plant. Maybe I don't need to work that hard at trying to get workers to come in here and work overtime. It is that very price signal that provides the incentive for correcting the problem. That's not to say some people don't screw some other people over when they in times of need. And I think that's sort of the distinction between what we want the market to happen and then what do I do as a good individual person. And if I'm, taking advantage of somebody that doesn't have any other options, and I'm essentially exploiting them, I think on an individual level, we can say that's make judgment calls about when that sort of doesn't look right and doesn't look
even that, like, because I was going to say, yeah, reputations are probably a lot more important in today's day and age than when you were selling Uncle Sam's old timey tooth remedy, because you could just go on to the next town. Well, now you can't do it. But the flip side of that is the mob then controls the narrative on who's okay to talk to and who's not, who did something bad and who is somebody that's unfair, versus somebody saying, hey, I don't need to get out my expense sheet to show you what all this costs me to get this to you. I'm just saying that's what it costs. So if somebody can do better, fine, but this is what I can deliver it for. And if you knock me out, it's going to get more expensive.
I've talked to several people in the grocery industry who are concerned because they're facing increasing prices for the products they're having to buy, but they don't want to look like they're price gouging. And so, they're looking for either somebody else to blame or just eat the cost, because, and it's exactly related to the reputational concerns you mentioned. You don't want to be the person that says, look at what, Price Chopper's doing or whatever, insert whatever store you want to. And so they are, consciously aware of that, so much so that they dampen some of those price fluctuations that we see, because they don't want to be seen as gouging consumers either.
I'm really very concerned about how, when things start to get shut down, how much harder it is to bring them back onto the system. Like, you're watching, we were talking before about restaurants being able to sell things out the back door instead of the front. Well, if you turn off a dairy plant because 30% of the milk was going to restaurants, there's a guy named Dwayne Faber, Faber84 on Twitter, and he talks all about, like, you can't just flip the processing from delivering to restaurants to delivering to grocery stores. So you have all this milk that's not being used. They got to dump it. If you make it so they can't dump it, that they have to use it, then they'll kill cows, right? Like, and things are going to get super wobbly here. How much time can elapse before we don't start seeing those kind of things wildly shoot into the system?
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking to see those pictures of dairy producers having to dump their milk out. And we could talk about the reasons for it, but whatever the reasons, it is heartbreaking, and people aren't going to just sit there and keep doing it. So, either you're right, either going to get rid of cows, or they're going to, try to find markets for those. There was a point in time where we had a lot more integrated, we have a lot more specialized operations now than we had in the past, with much more diversified operations. You normally have a few dairy cows, you had extra milk, you'd feed it to the hogs or whatever. Some of that goes on now, but, if this keeps going, either you get rid of those cows or you try to, find a neighbor that can make use of that in a way that you didn't before. And, how long does it take? I don't know. It depends on how precarious the position is for either one of those dairy producers, and how long these things going. And I think that's, this is the word everybody's using, but it's just because it's true. And that is the uncertainty. If we knew this was going to last for 2 more weeks and we go back to normal, okay, I can live in that environment. But this fact that we don't know, it makes it really, really hard to plan. And so everybody's having to make their own individual jujudgment about, do I kill these cows? Do I try to strike an agreement with my hog farmer neighbor, even if it's illegal right now? They're going to, we're going to practice a little civil disobedience because this is a stupid law in the moment. And some of that is going to go off on a one, individual level basis. And then you're right. And then what happens? So we go a little longer, we reduce our inventory. Now you got plants that can operate at full capacity, even if you go back to, whatever normal was, which means they're not as efficient. They can't be as cost effective. And on top of this, the people that are going into grocery stores or wherever to buy things have less money because they're not working. Yeah. I think so. I don't want to be overly pessimistic for the ag sector here, but often I've heard it said that agriculture is counter-cyclical to the overall economy. So during the last, Great Recession, it was a time we actually had big run-ups in ag commodity prices for entirely different reasons. But it's not so clear to me that that's going to happen this time around. That consumers are going to have less disposable income. At least in the last recession, they didn't eat out as much. They're not going to often meat and animal product items are more expensive. So that's something that people tend to cut back on. So I think that's going to trickle back to the farm level, particularly if you have some of these other disruptions where you talk about where we reduce capacity. I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but I'd say it's it is a little concerning for the few weeks and months ahead.
I think we're going to see a big upswing in raw materials being delivered to the grocery store as opposed to highly processed food put towards convenience. Convenience has been because we didn't have any time. Right now, people have time. And I would imagine that some of the habits that are coming in right now, which go along with eating more frugally, right, because you're not paying for somebody else to do the processing, I would imagine you'll see staples have some value there. But if you're dumping that out of the highly processed foods, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's hard to readjust.
That's right. And you think about, why is a lot of dairy being dumped? One of the reasons is there's less cheese moving in every pound of cheese you buy. I don't know how many gallons of milk, but it's a lot. And so that, cheese is essentially processing milk, and it uses a lot of milk. So a lot of milk gets used up. So you think about, just like you mentioned, processing, if you buy those raw ingredients yourself, maybe you don't need as much of it as going into some of the, more processed foods. But I don't know. I think it could go both ways. I mean, I think that's one of the research questions I have is what happened to the healthiness or healthfulness of people's diets right after this. I think it could go both ways. I think in the short run, people bought a lot of processed stuff. You can't buy ramen noodles right now. My two teenage boys keep asking me, Dad, why did you buy ramen noodles? And there are none, like in the grocery store. And so because people want that highly shelf stable kind of processed food they can have around for a while, but people are also sitting at home. They're maybe picking up some cooking skills they didn't have before, or figuring out how to use other stuff. So as this thing goes on a little longer, the phenomenon you just described could play itself out a little more. So
my dad used to watch this investment show, and at some point he would always ask them, all right, what are you holding for investments right now? I think for an ag economist, it is completely fair for me to say, what are you stocked up on in your house right now? How long can you go, and what foods did you choose to put there?
Oh, goodness. Honestly, we haven't changed a lot of our eating habits. And part of it is most of what we would normally buy has been available in our local grocery stores. So it hasn't changed a lot. Now, what I will say is for a variety of reasons, we had a bunch of meat that was in a freezer we had that hadn't been eaten in a long time. And partly because my wife had to go deal with a family health issue on her side of the family. So she's the one that's often averse to eating that, meat that's been in the freezer for 6 months. So when it was just me and my kids, we went through a lot of that, for about 2 weeks.
Okay.
So that we did eat a lot more. In fact, one of my sons said, I think we're gonna have steaks tonight. He said, Dad, we just had that. I was like, you're spoiled. Who says that? So we did run through a lot of that. We are, because my kids are home at lunch now at breakfast. And normally they're off at school, or they'll go out and eat at lunch. I've got teenagers, so they can go off campus and eat. But I will say, boxes of cereal, milk, and then again, ramen noodles, Kraft noodles. Those are what my boys want at lunchtime. And so, it's not the healthiest option, but that's what my teenagers want. So we're moving through that at a much faster rate than we normally do.
I think there is a huge divide. And I don't know if you ever saw, Charles Murray wrote a book called Coming Apart. Are you familiar with this book?
I read that. Yep.
And I think there is a huge difference between what's going on in the middle upper class houses across America versus what's going on with everybody else. Like if you went to college and you have a white collar job that you were able to move it, and you're kind of working, maybe you're working 4 hours a day, you're doing telecommuting, you realize there's not that much going on with your job. You can take care of your kids and do these things. You've still got a paycheck coming in.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that is not the case. And they are looking at their family and they're saying, is it better for me to go out and be an Instacart worker or deliver for Amazon and potentially bring this back for my family? Or is it better that I stay home? And there's a lot of economics going on right now in the different classes, and I think the upper classes could be completely unaware of what's going on with the people that are poor.
I agree 100%. I'd say even in my, small world of, academics and, stuff I'm involved with, I'd say it's even bimodal in that world, in the sense of, my schedule is probably busier than it normally is, and it's normally pretty packed, and that's because people want me to go talk on the news. I've got to manage faculty that are teaching classes and all the problems we have with moving that online. So my busyness has increased. At the same time, I know a lot of my colleagues are, they don't have anything to do, or it's unclear what they should do, or they have kids they got to take care of. I mean, I'm fortunate my kids are old enough they can kind of take care of themselves. But, I've been on lots of conference calls where, people's kids will run up in their lap, and I think it's kind of nice, to kind of normalize a little more of that. But these things that would have seemed totally uncouth even a month ago are just totally normal. I've seen more people ceiling fans and workout clothes in the last 3 weeks than I've seen in a really long time. But you're right. Back to your point. I hope my universities operate. I suspect we'll take a budget cut because incomes aren't going to come in, but I suspect I'll get paid. But that's not what a lot of other people are seeing in this run up that we saw in unemployment. Unemployment filings was just incredibly unprecedented. I don't know if you saw the front page of the New York Times that had, this long time series of unemployment filings, going back, even, decades. It kind of bumped around, and then this, last week there was they put this graph on the bottom of the page, and the spike was so large, it went up the entire page of the front page, just to show how out of proportion the number of unemployment filings was relative to what we, have expected to see. And so that's what's happening to a lot of people. And, again, on it, just speaking frankly, that's a world, I'm not living in. It's hard for me to relate to that one at the moment, even though I can try to empathize. So, what those people are experiencing and going through, it's got to be gut wrenching and heart wrenching, and it's got to translate into what they buy for food and what they eat.
And there are a lot of people right now that are really busy, like you said, where they're making more money if they're in an entrepreneurial situation. And then you think about the person that, they don't have an education and they don't have a way to get around. They have to take public transport. And you're seeing people that are well fed and warm in their houses, or cool as it were. It was 80 degrees yesterday. But and they're calling for mass transit to be shut down, or for any type of gathering, or to really limit the number of workers that can be in one place. And it's a really tough balance, because we know that if you want to contain this, you have to have really strict measures. But at the same time, you're talking about people that can't miss a paycheck. And if they do, they have to default on debt, or they have to default on rent, or they have to default on getting things done they need to get done.
Yeah. And to your point, the people deciding those things are not always the same people living through those circumstances. And so, I guess it's sort of been one of my hobby horses over the last 7 or 8 years, is this sort of elitism that exists sometimes in our food system, that the people who make the decisions about what's culturally appropriate to eat and whatever else and that can influence our food politics and food dialogue, are often have very different set of preferences than folks that are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. They're spending a lot, much higher percentage of their income on food. And this is another form of that, I think, that's just be manifested in a slightly different way. So I think it is, a challenge for all of us, and to just try to have a little bit of empathy and a little bit of understanding about, people that are different than us.
Yeah, I wonder when unemployment doesn't match up with the amount of money that people get, and they have to start going to food banks. As that number increases, then the level of tension in a given society increases. So I hope that those numbers can come back, but the only way that happens is if we get the economy started. And right now we've made the choice that the health is more important than the economy, but we better recognize that these people aren't bad people. If they start pushing back on these regulations, they're just trying to figure out their way in this world.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting, fascinating to watch how the narratives emerge as we, came out of this. You think about the last recession, I don't know that it was entirely true, but the narrative that came out of it was this is the fault of Wall Street and big banks. It kind of gave rise to this Occupy Wall Street movement, which had, a number of implications and repercussions. And I think it'll be interesting to see what is the narrative that comes out of this. Who's at fault? Who took advantage of people? Who benefited from the government's, bailouts and stimulus? And I can see, on my social media and reading the news, even with the latest, I don't know what we call this thing. It's not stimulus, but this CARES bill that was passed, who's benefiting from that, and is it the everyday person or not? And people are fighting for the narrative on that. So I think people need to be very cautious of those things because, we don't want to end up in a world where it creates an unstable society or where your vested interest is no longer with the status quo, but in something a little more revolutionary. I think that's when things can get really bad.
So changing subjects, but it's something I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on. You are aware of how many different kinds of regulations have either been pushed for or have actually happened regarding climate change and the humane treatment towards animals, ever increasing desires or demands for care, and saying the farmer can't make the right choices. We need to set these rules up. I have heard a hypothesis that in a lot of ways, these types of pressure are what have kept us from being able to get protein into various communities. And in places like China, if you don't have access to livestock and domesticated protein, you're going to get it through a wild system. Would you agree that you could at least draw that kind of jump? And how would you set up a test to figure out if the push that people were making for climate change could actually have the knock-on effect of creating these scenarios for protein markets that bring us coronavirus?
Yeah, boy, that's a really interesting connection. So I'm sidestepping your question and answering a different one, which is what good politicians do. I'm not a politician, but they, one thing, speaking of China, that had happened here recently is that this big African swine fever problem, it resulted in, over half of their hog supply herd getting killed, which is more pigs than we have in all of the United States. And it's a big run up in prices for pork there. Now, to what extent, getting back to the thing that you just mentioned, to what extent did that lead people to substitute towards some of these wilder alternatives? I don't know, but the effect can't be zero. People weren't eating pork. They still want to get protein somewhere. Where's it going to come from? And so I think that phenomenon is real. I think,
the Chinese government, they know that people need access to protein. That's not lost on them. So It's not like they were saying, oh, we didn't know that these wet markets were going on. They were saying, hey, we allow this because we know that in order to keep our civilization happy and us in power, we got to do that.
I agree. And I think, this is going kind of counter trend to the discussion we talked about. I think, a lot of folks were prognosticating that after that African swine fever, China still had a pork production system where a lot of pork production was happening very small, almost think backyard kind of operations, which is where a lot of this disease spread. And, I don't know if many of the folks that listen to your podcast have tried to get on a commercial hog farm in the U.S. It's hard because there's a lot of biosecurity protacols. You can't do it.
Yeah, I've only been on the Fair Oaks farm one. I've never been to a full farm, and I grew up in Eureka, Illinois, so they were everywhere around my house.
Yeah, and so that before a lot of this, and this kind of goes opposite of this, move towards more local. But I think the large thought is what's going to happen in China is you're going to have a big, large scale consolidation. After all this and trying to get rid of all this really small backyard sort of stuff. And, whether that still happens or not, kind of remains to be seen. But,
has China recovered from the African swine fever? It's out of the news, but it's not like they came up with a vaccine.
To be honest, I haven't paid as much attention to it over the last couple of months because of all other news events. I think the worst of it seemed to have been over. And, in terms of prices, they were starting to kind of come back down, although they were also importing a lot more. We had this trade war going on, and they were starting to import, more pork from the U.S. and other places. So, but I don't know that it was completely went away. But the short answer is I'm not entirely sure where the status of that is. But to your point, it's probably not the things that capture the news on the increase the cost of meat at the moment. A lot of stuff about climate change is sort of proposed, people arguing about what should happen, but there are a lot of regulations around, environmental protection, CAFOs, some of that kind of stuff. And I'm not trying to say they're bad laws, but they do increase the price of meat. And then a lot of the food safety regulations we see in meat processing facilities that affect the cost of meat. That's where a lot of the regulatory costs come in at the moment. And but to the same extent, if you had a packing plant and you're devoting increasing portions of your production capacity to these various certification programs that are promising higher animal welfare or higher whatever, that is impacting the cost of the system.
Yeah, that's right. And I think everybody comes at these things with good intention. I think people come to it and they say the meat has the potential to really make a lot of people sick. So we want to make sure that we do this right and we have it by the book. And I know the people at NAMI, they are good people working hard, right?
Yeah.
But you can imagine situations where these regulations end up making it a lot harder around the world. And so what does a country do if they realize we don't have enough food right now?
Well, you can't produce food overnight. And I think that's one of the things that's tied up in all this. I think people forget when they talk about food supply, seasonal, so a lot of the food we had ready to go in the market this month, it was produced before. If it's a grain or, rice or wheat or corn, it was produced last summer in the winter. So, agricultural seasonal. So you can't just generate more food overnight. So you really do, if you don't have enough now, your option is to try to find somebody else to sell it to you. And that's trade. That's trying to buy off of world markets, on at least some of the ag commodity side of things. I mean, wheat prices have kind of come up a fair amount in the last, few weeks, but corn and soybeans still, by historical standards are pretty low at the moment. Now you're not going to eat field corn, but you can process it into starch and flour and tortillas and some other things. So that's kind of one of your market options. Other things. I mean,
has the ethanol plant shutdown start to affect the price of corn? So for people that don't know, yeah. Right now there are ethanol plants that the value of the amount they can sell ethanol for is so little because the Saudis dropped the oil prices. There's this big price war. So regular just crude oil is much cheaper. So when you shut down those ethanol plants, it knocks out a huge amount of feed that goes into the beef cattle market. And in particular, protein. They need to, if you're going to get cows to put on big muscle, they have to be eating protein, which you get from the ethanol plants. Mm-hmm. And that's been wiped out of the market.
No, that's right, and you see it reflected in corn prices. I mean, they've really taken quite a hit over the last month or so. So, that's not good for corn farmers, but it does have beneficial impacts on the rest of the food system in terms of making that food more available, to feed livestock or to go into other, kind of processed food items. So, I'm not really answering the question you asked, which is if you're a country that doesn't have enough food, what can you do? Trade is one, and sometimes trade does involve barriers and trying to negotiate with other countries. So that that is something that one could do. Transportation and storage is another thing as well. We have lots of food in storage here in the U.S. A lot of it is I would say virtually all of it is in commercial storage, so private storage. So it's big companies. If it's grain, ADM, Cargill, Bunge, these kinds of companies, they're storing it strategically because if they think prices are going to increase in the future, they're going to hold on to it now, try to sell it later in the future. But there are countries around the world that do have strategic stockpiles of food. So, they could pull some of those out. We were talking about China. They had a strategic stockpile of pork that they did release some when it got to near the Chinese New Year. And so some countries around the world do have inventories of food that they could release that could help dampen the pressure. But, at the moment, world food prices are affordable, and we talked about dumping milk. I mean, milk's not easily transportable, but there is food out there, and so I think a lot of it is just trying to get it to where it needs to go.
Well, I think that's a pretty hopeful message. Like that. That's good. I'm glad you think that, because I, in my limited understanding of the food system, we're in a very precarious place. So I keep my eye on it very closely. But I realize that we probably have some shock room in there, and we can absorb quite a bit. Yeah,
I mean, I think both things can happen at the same time. I mean, again, I mentioned kind of price as a signal of scarcity, and so a lot of my comments are reflecting the fact that at least on commodity side, prices are still pretty low. At the same time, though, so not to contradict myself, but some of that's also related to if there are disruptions in the food processing side of things, that if you can't process food, you're going to lower the demand for those raw agricultural commodities. So commodity prices can stay low. So it is possible to have a world in which commodity prices are low and retail food prices are high. If the processing sector it is not operating very well, and I know this was happening in the beef industry for the last several weeks. Cattle producers are really upset because wholesale prices were increasing, cattle prices were falling. And that on the surface of it doesn't look fair. And I'm not going to weigh in on whether there was anti-competitive practices. But what I can say is that in some cases that's just economics at work. So you can end up with these situations where you have a lot of these raw commodities that are cheap, but retail food that's expensive. And maybe that gets us to the world that you mentioned, where if that's true, people are going to want to buy a lot more raw commodities and deal with those raw foodstuffs.
Well, who knows what's going to happen, but we are watching history unfold. So if people wanted to read more about your background, like the stuff that you're into, I did a terrible job introducing you. You're at the university, you're at Purdue, right?
Yeah, Purdue University. I'm the head of the agricultural economics department. So I blog under my name. So I've got a funny name, Jayson with a Y, JAYSONLUSK.com. And so I'll normally, about once a week have something to say there. I write lots of academic papers, which probably aren't that relevant to your audience. But before this, I'd written several popular books about food and agriculture. But I think one of the things, last week, I think even on my blog, I tried to put up links to things my colleagues have been doing both here at Purdue and across the country. And I've been really proud, I think, of the response, at least of my academic colleagues, trying to at least get out whatever information we have to try to help understand what's happening, whether it's in cattle markets or retail food markets, food supply chains. So, I mean, we're not producing more food, but we're at least trying to understand what's happening and see if there are problems we can't help understand and solve. And I look around at my university and see a variety of initiatives, from engineering where people are trying to print 3D face masks to, I know we've got a group here on campus that's trying to figure out if they can set up online markets to get some of this maybe food that's in these more regional food systems, but they've lost their restaurant establishments. Can we create online marketplaces where consumers can find that?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So I think that's been kind of heartening to me to say, people are really trying to step up, and whatever talents we have, trying to apply it to this problem.
Well, this sounds fantastic, and I'm glad to hear that you guys are contributing and becoming essential in your own way. I mean, that's really what we all have to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me, and we will catch up again later. Maybe in a couple weeks we'll have some more to talk about.
I hope so. I've listened to several of your podcasts, so I'm happy to actually be a guest.
Good to see you, Jayson.
All right. Thanks, Vance.